In this video, I will review the timeline of the contract, the Pennsylvania agreement for the sale of real estate. So anywhere in the agreement of sale, it mentions a date or a deadline, I will review it with you, and it is highlighted. So paragraph 1 on page 2, by this agreement dated blank. Seller hereby agrees to sell and convey to buyer who agrees to purchase the identified property. So that is just the date that the offer is written, and that doesn't change and doesn't really affect anything. It's the execution date that determines when things are due in the contract period up until closing. In paragraph 2, you have the initial deposit is due within a certain number of days of the execution date. Of course, again, the execution date is the date both parties have signed off on the agreement, and that is day 0, and the next day is day 1. So the default is 5 days, but I always like to see that first deposit within 2 to 3 days of the execution date. And then, of course, another deadline would be an additional deposit is due within a certain number of days of the execution date. Usually we sandwich the inspection negotiations with this date. So if you use the traditional 10-5-2, 10-day contingency period, the 5-day negotiation period, and the 2-day buyer final response period, then that would be 17 days, and you might make this day 18. If you shorten all that up, you might make that second deposit earlier. And then, of course, the remaining balance will be paid at settlement, which is in paragraph 4. And then, of course, all funds paid by buyer within 30 days of closing. So at closing, possibly the second deposit, possibly the first deposit if it's a short turnaround time for the closing, must be in certified funds. So that's a wire or certified check, money order. And then, of course, another date and deadline in the contract is settlement and possession. So you'll indicate what date the buyer would like to settle, and that will be a Monday through Friday during normal business hours. And it will occur in the county in which it was located or an adjacent county, again, during normal business hours, unless otherwise agreed to by buyer and seller. And of course, that relies on the title company having a notary to facilitate the closing, and if there's a loan involved, if they're allowing it to happen outside of normal business hours. So in paragraph 4H, if there is a tenant in the property and there's a lease, you'll want to check this off because there are dates and deadlines that are in that tenant occupied property addendum, and we'll review that here. Paragraph 5, date and time is of the essence, so the written acceptance of all parties will be on or before. So this is like the expiration date of the agreement of sale, so that if the seller signs off on the agreement after the date that you put in here, then the buyer can call this agreement voidable and not buy the property because the seller didn't sign it on time. Of course, if you're negotiating and you extend beyond that time frame, of course, you can always just put a new date when the buyer refreshes the contract, puts all the new terms in the contract that have been agreed to, update that acceptance date to the day they believe that both parties will have signed off on it, and that is totally acceptable. And of course, the settlement date and other dates are identified for the performance of any obligations in this agreement are of the essence and are binding. So they're enforceable. They mean something. They don't have wiggle room. Again, the execution date is the date that buyer and seller have indicated full acceptance by signing or initialing every page or every change in term of the agreement. And it says, for the purposes of this agreement, the number of days will be counted from the execution date, excluding the day the agreement was executed and including the last day of the time period. So basically midnight of that time frame. So again, if let's say it's a Tuesday, everybody's signed off on it, day 1 is the next day, and then they have a 5 full 24-hour period for that first deposit, let's say if it's due by day 5. And of course, any changes to the agreement should be initialed and dated. That is especially important if you go back and forth and have the buyer and seller initial changes as they go. You want to make sure dates are on them so that you can make sure that all of the dates and initials are on or before the acceptance date. So the settlement date is not extended unless it's done mutually and in writing. So even if you're moving settlement earlier than closing on the settlement date, which again is in paragraph 4, in either way, people make plans based on settlement date. So you may want to have it in writing that the settlement date has been changed. And in either case, you need to have that in writing. And then they indicate here certain terms and time periods are pre-printed for the convenience of buyer and seller, but they're all negotiable and may be changed by striking out the pre-printed text and inserting a different term. There's 2 instances where there are pre-printed terms. One is where you see that it's in parentheses after the blank where it says blank days 5 if not specified, so that if you don't write anything, the default is 5. But there are other terms that will have a pre-printed day count that is already in here. So presumably you could strike that, and then you want to make sure that the buyer initials it and then the seller also initials it. And the only date that you would not be able to change would be in paragraph 16, I would assume, where it says except where restricted by law. So the law is saying the condo deadlines, the HOA deadlines are established by law, not by negotiation. The next date in the agreement of sale is in paragraph 8, the mortgage contingency. So in 8B, you'll indicate when you would like the lender to have sent over to the buyer and then to the seller a loan approval. That could be conditional or an outright approval. So after this date, the seller has the right to terminate on the buyer if they have not submitted the loan approval to the seller. So that's paragraph 8B1. If the seller does not receive a copy on or by that date, the seller can then terminate up until any time that the buyer gives them the loan approval. So there's that limbo period between this date that you write here and when the loan approval is actually given to the buyer. So if you're on the buy side, do request an extension for this date if you know it's going to be late. If you're on the listing side, I would not want to sign an extension. I would want to maintain the seller's right to terminate, because if it seems like it's taking too long, there seems to be something wrong with the buyer's application, and the seller potentially has another offer coming in, they may want to maintain their right to terminate. And of course, if they terminate, they do need to give the buyer their deposit money back. And that's according to paragraph 8B3 down here. All deposit money will be returned to the buyer. Now, if the lender does give the buyer, and then who gives the seller, a conditional or outright approval, but it doesn't satisfy the terms in this section above. For example, let's say it says it's an FHA loan and the seller's like, I'm not going to comply with an FHA appraisal. I did not agree to that. Then the seller can terminate the agreement and give the buyer their money back. Or let's say it contains a provision not specified in the agreement, like the buyer must settle on another property, or the appraisal must be received by the lender, or the approval is not valid through the settlement date, and that it can't be satisfied or removed by day 7 after this loan approval date, then the seller can terminate but give the buyer their money back. So some conditions like obtaining insurance, confirming employment would be done at the beginning and then again right before closing. But this is for some big items that may actually take longer to resolve. So in essence, if a buyer gets a loan approval that indicates they have to do something or the appraisal is not yet received, then they have 7 days to clear that up before the seller's right to terminate comes into play. So on the listing side, I always want to think about this date, the loan approval, as this date plus 7 days, because the buyer still has 7 days to clear any unusual conditions. And if I'm on the listing side and I know there's a tight turnaround and my client needs to make plans, rather than putting a 30-day period in here, I will ask the buyer's agent to put a 21-day window in there. And that way I know the buyer will still have 21 days plus 7 to get through the appraisal process and the underwriting process. And that still should be plenty of time. Again, if the agreement is terminated based on what we just discussed, then all deposit monies will be returned to the buyer and the agreement is void. And the buyer is responsible for any costs incurred by buyer. So there are some instances where the seller is responsible to refund the buyer or reimburse the buyer if there's a cancellation for title or insurance fees. And for the appraisal, that's if the seller can't clear title. But in this case, if the buyer can't obtain their financing and the seller terminates, well, the seller does not owe the buyer anything. They just terminate, give them their deposit back, and they move on. Another date and deadline in the contract is in paragraph 8D. The buyer must lock in their interest rate if they're getting a loan at least 15 days prior to closing. So in these terms, they've indicated the maximum rate that the buyer is willing to accept. So technically, if the buyer does not lock in their rate at least 15 days prior to closing, and that rate goes above this amount, well, first of all, they're considered in default. But if they intend to go to closing, nobody's going to care or call them out as being in default, so long as they accept whatever rate is available. So the buyer's right to get the seller to pay for points to get them back into this rate range that they've indicated is no longer available to the buyer who did not lock in at least 15 days prior to closing. And you'll see here, buyer gives seller the right at seller's sole option and as permitted by law and the mortgage lender to contribute financially without promise of reimbursement to buyer and or the mortgage lender to make the mortgage terms available to buyer. So again, if the buyer does not lock in at least 15 days prior to closing, then the buyer is technically in default and they have no right to ask the seller to get them in the rate range if the rate has gone above the maximum they said they were willing to accept in the contract. The next date and deadline in the contract is that within 7 days of the execution date, the buyer will make their full mortgage application, including their payment and ordering of credit reports, etc., etc. So paragraph G does have dates and deadlines, but these are less commonly found, but I will mention them here, that if the insurance company requires corrections to the property, the buyer will submit them to the seller, and then the seller will let the buyer know within 5 days of receiving those requirements whether they plan to make the repairs or not make the repairs. And then the buyer will decide within 15 days of that whether they will make the repairs at buyer's expense or terminate the agreement and get their deposit money back. The next set of dates and deadlines in the agreement of sales, paragraph 13, the inspection contingency. So the contingency period is a default of 10 days from the execution date of the agreement for each of the inspections elected in paragraph 12C. So 12C starts on page 7. So that includes the home inspection, the wood infestation, also known as termite inspection, deeds restriction zoning, water service, radon, on-lot sewage if applicable, property and flood insurance, property boundaries, lead-based paint hazards, and other if there's any other inspection that is desired. So within the 10 days or whatever day you fill in here, the buyer either will accept, terminate, or what I say, negotiate. They'll present the seller with a written corrective proposal listing any corrections or credits desired by the buyer. So by midnight, day 10, either the buyer is accepting the property, terminating, so they would submit a TerraRel, a termination and release form, where they sign off that they're terminating according to paragraph 13. I would just say 12 and 13. And their release portion, they're indicating who's holding the deposit money and that they're entitled to get it back. And then lastly, if the buyer is looking to get a seller assist, which is like credits for those repairs, or they're looking for the seller to do repairs, or as a last case effort, or in the case of cash, they're looking for a lower sales price, they would fill out a buyer reply to inspection, and then once agreed to, the buyer and seller will sign off on a change in terms addendum. So following the end of that 10-day as a default contingency period, the buyer and seller will have a default of 5 days for a negotiation period. So I like to think of this as the seller's due diligence period, where they get to do their due diligence. And if, let's say, a roof repair was requested, now is their opportunity to find out how much that's actually going to cost. And I always prefer a seller to find out actual costs before committing to something, because you just never know what something is going to cost when you actually have a contractor come in and give you a quote. So during that period, the seller can get their quotes if they need to and negotiate back and forth with the buyer. Now, their first option is to agree to satisfy the terms of all the buyer's requests or negotiate another mutually acceptable written agreement. So they have offered to do 3 things out of 5 things, and the buyer is okay with that, then the buyer has bought the property. Now, in the last period in the inspection contingency, if no mutually acceptable written agreement is reached, or the seller doesn't respond during that 5-day period, then within 2 days following the end of the negotiation period, the buyer will accept the property or terminate the agreement and get their deposit back. Paragraph C does have some dates and deadlines, so it's not very common if you're mostly working with public sewer, but if you are working with a property that has a septic system, if there's a report that reveals the need to expand or replace the existing system, then the seller within 25 days of receiving the report will submit the proposal to the buyer. And then within 5 days of receiving the seller's proposal, let the seller know whether or not the buyer agrees to the terms of the proposal, terminates the agreement and get their deposit money back, or accepts the property and the existing system and releases the seller, if allowed by the lender, or they may have to correct it within a certain time frame. as dictated by the local governmental authority. And if the seller denies buyer permission or access to correct the defects, then the buyer has a 5-day period to decide to terminate the agreement and get their deposit money back. So the next date and deadline in the contract is in paragraph 14A, title surveys and costs. So the buyer has 7 days as a default to order the title report for the property. And typically the buyer's agent will do that on the buyer's behalf, and we routinely do it on day 1 or day 2. So we're not waiting till day 7 to do that. Paragraph 15 has the next set of dates and deadlines in the contract. So if there's a notice of public or private assessments, as described in paragraph 10F, which is in the seller representation section, whether it's from a public improvement or condo or HOA association that remains unpaid, or any notice from the government or a public authority, well, number one, if they know of any, and if there are any code violations, they need to list that here. And technically the buyer's agent will list that here, but the seller needs to disclose that in the disclosure, and then the buyer's agent puts that here. And then in paragraph 15, this is mostly assuming if it comes to light during the due diligence or during the contract period. So if the seller receives any of these notices after the seller has signed this agreement and before settlement, within 5 days of receiving those notices or assessments, they'll tell the buyer about them. And then they'll tell the buyer whether or not they'll comply with the notices or assessments at seller's expense before closing. And if they do, then the buyer's bought the property. If the seller says, you know what, I know you're paying X price for this property and you didn't anticipate paying $8,000 towards this common element in my homeowners association, but I'm not going to comply with this notice, and you can either take the property or leave it. So then the buyer will tell the seller within 5 days whether or not the buyer will comply with the notice or terminate the agreement. So in certain circumstances, it may be better for the buyer to move forward, even though the property now costs them more. They may not have any better choices. Typically, in my experience, people typically negotiate because at that point, nobody wants to lose. But it's really whoever has the stronger BATNA, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, has the stronger position. So if the seller has a potential buyer in the wings who would pay the same and accept that notice or that assessment, they may say, no, I'm not going to take care of that for you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. And the buyer who says, you know what, there's another property that just came on the market. I think I'll go buy that one instead. And they can go do it. There's not, let's say, a ton of competition. Then they might say, you know what, I'm not going to pay this. And they'll let the seller know, hey, we're terminating the agreement and getting our deposit back. Now, the municipal certification is another thing that is required by the municipality. So option A is optional. It may not happen. Whereas B happens with every sale where the municipality requires a certification about no uncorrected code violations on the property and what the allowable use of the property is. So not all municipalities require it, but most do. So within 30 days of the execution date of the agreement, but in no case later than 15 days prior to settlement, seller will order this certification, disclosing any uncorrected code violations in zoning, housing, building, safety, or fire ordinances, and or a certificate permitting occupancy of the property. So in most cases, the seller is ordering this certificate, they're complying with it, or there are no uncorrected code violations and they're just handing it off to the buyer. If the seller orders it and they want to negotiate the repairs that may be required or correcting the violations, then they need to follow these deadlines because they have no rights after these deadlines to ask anything of the buyer. So in a 30-day agreement of sale, they would need to order it 15 days at least prior to closing. In a 45-day agreement of sale, they would need to order it by day 30. If it's, let's say, a 60-day or 90 or 120-day agreement of sale, they would still need to order it by no later than day 30. And if the buyer receives any notice of required repairs or improvements, they will deliver it to the seller. Now, within 5 days of receiving the notice from the municipality, the seller will deliver that to the buyer and let the buyer know that they will make the required repairs or improvements to satisfy the municipality, and the buyer buys the property. Or if the seller decides not to make the required repairs or improvements, then the buyer will let the seller know within 5 days whether or not they will accept a temporary access certificate or a temporary use and occupancy certificate to do the repairs and at the buyer's expense after settlement. or terminate the agreement and get their deposit money back. So if the buyer fails to respond or fails to terminate, then the buyer's bought the property. And then again, if repairs or improvements are required and seller fails to give that to the buyer as required, again, the seller will perform all those repairs, improvements as required by the notice at seller's expense, and this will survive settlement. So I can imagine a situation where for some reason the listing agent didn't get the certificate from the municipality and the buyer later learns that they should have gotten this and there were uncorrected code violations on the property. Well, it is the seller's responsibility at the seller's expense to correct that, even if they've already gone to closing. The next date and deadline in the contract applies to condos and HOAs and properties in planned communities. So if the buyer is buying a new condo or a new property in an HOA, they will have 15 days and 7 days respectively to review the condo or HOA documents. If the buyer is buying from a seller who's bought from a seller or bought from the developer, that is considered a resale, and there are different timeframes that apply. And let me back up. So when a developer is selling a property that's in a condo or HOA, they need to give those documents no later than the date the buyer executes the agreement. So this little section here, the buyer needs to get that before they even sign the agreement. And then they have 15 or 7 days to review those documents and terminate for any reason. Even if there's no inspections, they can terminate because of those documents. And then for a resale property that's part of a condo or planned community, the seller is 15 days at seller's expense to request the certificate of resale and all the other required documents to comply with the act. And then the association has 10 days to get that to the seller. And then the seller gets that over to the buyer. And then the buyer is 5 days after receipt of those documents to review those documents and decide if they would like to move forward, terminate the agreement, get their deposit money back, or if they have questions. Usually the easiest thing is just to call the management company who's managing the property, if any, or submit all the questions in writing to the listing agent for them to find out from the seller. Here's another date and deadline in the contract, but this is not commonly used and would come up usually right around settlement. If any part of the property included in the sale fails before settlement, the seller will repair or replace that part, or let the buyer know that they'll credit the buyer, or not repair, replace, and not credit. So if the seller decides not to repair or replace and not credit the buyer has 5 days or before settlement, whichever is earlier, that the buyer will either accept the property or terminate the agreement and get their deposit money back. By the time this happens, we are so close to settlement, usually the parties will negotiate something. It hurts a little bit on both sides maybe, but do whatever it takes to get to the closing table. The next date in the contract that I discuss more at length in the default and termination of return of deposits happens after settlement, and that's the deadline by which the seller has to file a claim to keep the buyer's deposit monies if there's a dispute over that. So that's not necessarily in the timeline of the contract, but I will alert you to that. And then in paragraph 32A, this is where you'd indicate any of the addenda that you'd like to include, and most of these addenda do have time components to them that will be added to your timeline of the transaction. So you may have noticed that there are a bunch of dates and deadlines throughout the contract. They're not in sequential order. So once you do go under contract, you're going to want to extract all the relevant deadlines and put them in order. And then you'll want to incorporate the dates and deadlines found in these addenda, some of which we will review here. And then, of course, the buyer and seller will date when they've signed, because that would indicate the execution of the contract, and that would be day 0, the final date on the contract, and then day 1 would be the next day. So the appraisal contingency addendum to the agreement of sale has a default of 30 days from the execution date to get the appraisal from the Pennsylvania certified appraiser. So again, be mindful to line this up with the loan approval date plus 7. So if you use a date 23 days out, then these deadlines will coincide. But if you use let's say a loan approval date that's 30 days out from the execution date, well, you just shortened your contingency period if you just leave this at the default. Rather, say 37 days or 45 days, take it until closing, because really, if the seller hasn't terminated and the appraisal is still outstanding and it doesn't come back at the sales price, then there's a cause to renegotiate. By having this appraisal contingency addendum unnecessarily or with a deadline that doesn't coincide with the rights in the agreement of sale, you've just created gray area and potentially limited the buyer's rights. And we don't need to cause confusion. It's better to not use this form if it's not needed, like for a conventional sale, it's not needed. FHA, it's not needed. VA, PHFA, USDA, this is not needed if the buyer wants the property to appraise for the sales price. Those protections are already embedded in the contract. For a cash offer where they want it to appraise for the purchase price, absolutely use this form. The 30 days is the only time frame that's referenced anywhere for a cash deal, and it's on this form. If the buyer using financing or cash is willing to accept a lower appraised value, well, then this form is appropriate. But again, just be mindful to create a deadline here that is the same as or longer than what's in the agreement of sale so as not to limit the scope of the buyer's rights. And again, buyers will choose option 1 or 2, and within the contingency period, they need to act. So if they select option 1, within that 30 days, they deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller, and they'll either terminate or negotiate with the seller. And if they don't terminate or negotiate with the seller within the contingency period, the buyer has waived their contingency. So all of it must be done within the 30 days if you use that as a default. You don't want to wait till day 30 and say, hey, it's a lower appraisal, we'd like to negotiate a lower price. No, if the next day happens, day 31 comes and goes, and you've bought the property. And then similarly in option 2, if the appraisal is not completed within the contingency period, buyers accepting the property at that purchase price. And they can complete settlement using any of the following or combination thereof, providing additional funds, so paying extra cash, adjusting the loan amount or the loan to value. In the tenant-occupied property addendum, you'll see the default is within 5 days of the execution date of the agreement, seller will furnish to buyer copies of all the written lease agreements currently in effect and memoranda of any oral leases for the property. So if there are any oral leases, it would be best to get them in writing and signed off by the seller and the tenant so that it is clear what is agreed to and that the buyer will be subject to those terms after closing. So the buyer then has a 5-day period in which to review all of the leases and or memoranda and decide if they will accept the property based on the information given, terminate the agreement of sale based on that information and get their deposit back, or negotiate an acceptable written agreement with the seller. So it might mean the seller pays funds to satisfy the buyer who does not like a specific term in the lease agreement or something like that. And of course, if it requires the tenant's approval, then the tenant is going to need to sign off as well. And last form we'll discuss here is the change in terms addendum. So this deadline, usually I put about 5 to 7 days prior to closing, just depending on how many repairs there are. The more repairs, the farther in advance of closing I'd like them to be done, because I'd like to be able to go over, visually check what I can check, and then have the inspector go and re-inspect the repairs that were made to make sure that they were done in a workmanlike manner and that it satisfies what the buyer was expecting. If you find yourself the need to change the acceptance date, this is a place that you can do it. If you ever need to change the settlement date, this is where you'll do it. You'll insert the original settlement date and then you'll put the new settlement date. Whether you move it back or forward, I encourage you to use this form. The mortgage term, so if you need to change the deadline for the buyer to apply for the mortgage and it said 7 in the contract, then you just insert a date here, that deadline for the buyer to apply for the mortgage. If you need to change the date for the lender's approval, that's that deadline in 8B where I typically recommend anywhere from 21 to 30 days from the offer or the signing of the agreement. You have to choose a date. But if you need to get an extension and the seller is okay with that, then you put the original loan approval date and then you put the new loan approval date here. Paragraph 6, time period. So anytime you need to get an extension for, let's say, inspections, this is a great form to use. I see some agents will write language. Rather than write language and pretend like you're a lawyer, just use the pre-printed forms and find out the paragraph, probably paragraph 13 something, line whatever of the agreement of sale, and then you change it to I did this recently. We needed to extend the home inspection for the chimney because we did not have a chimney inspector out there initially, and the inspector said, hey, you might want to get a chimney inspector. So we originally had 10 days in the agreement, and we wrote in 20 days here so that it was clear that that 10-day period was now 20 days. I've also seen it where you actually can put a date. I think this is vague enough where you can just put a date there that's in the future. And then in that specific instance, I did write for the chimney inspection only. So that way the rest of the home inspection was completed, already negotiated, and the only extension was for the chimney. And then if you have an addendum with a time frame and you need to change that, you can again put in the paragraph, the line of the blank, fill in the name of the addendum, and then change it to whatever the new date is. And that is an overview of the main dates and deadlines that you will find in the agreement of sale. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. You saw some sections that I didn't highlight because they're not as common as the ones that I did highlight. And there are other forms like the sale and settlement and the short sale addendum. I'll review those in other videos. They also have dates and deadlines. They're not as common as these main contracts that I reviewed with you, the change in terms addendum, the tenant occupied property addendum, and the appraisal contingency addendum. So check those videos out.